the book will be on the question of whether there actually is a turning point, while talking about the downturn and the nature of the downturn itself. First, let me just go over what's being said about the downturn. I think it's interesting that in general, the official commentators, the Financial Times, the financial press, the broadsheets and so forth, are taking, in general, a very gloomy line. In contrast, of course, I had this absurd debate with PR, who actually argued that it's unimportant. It's kind of unbelievable that anybody on the left would actually say that, but that is the case. And it's quite clear if you go through the different viewpoints of the different groups on the net, which I've done, that while they're outlining that the fact that there is a downturn, just repeating some statistics and so forth, they're not very clear as to what is happening. What they're certainly not saying is that this is a major change. In contrast, we actually get the Financial Times saying that in terms of different commentators, not in their editorials, which have actually moved to the right compared to what they had been, but they are in their various commentaries coming out fairly clearly. None of the commentators commit themselves to anything, but they come out with various quotations, various viewpoints, which seem to take the view that this is the worst downturn since 1945. And of course, it's now very clear that Mervyn King takes the view that this what is a downturn of 1929 proportions, only not like 1929 is the government intervened. I think that too has become a fairly common viewpoint by those who seem to know something about it, namely that the only comparator is in fact 1929. Now, of course, when you're comparing it with 1929, there's no question that it is very, very important, and it has to be a downturn. It has to be a severe downturn, and it has to be a turning point if we compare it with that. But it's constantly compared with that. Just look at what Martin Wolf in the Financial Times was quoting. This is in February this year, under the headline, the mother of all downturns. And he quotes Nouriel Roubini, whom you may know, but he's been frequently quoted, the professor at Columbia, who says that there's a rising probability of a catastrophic financial and economic outcome. You can't really go much further, in fact. So I think it's fairly clear that at least certain commentators, not, it has to be said, the rank and file economists who never predict a downturn, who never expect a downturn, who never predict anything correctly, they of course have nothing to say. Occasionally you get commentaries from Summers in the Financial Times, but it's very largely saying, how can we get out of this? The Economist in 2000, when there was a downturn in March 2000, pointed out that 99% of economists didn't predict anything. And when talking the present downturn, said, given their history, the fact that they say nothing is very bad. So one doesn't expect economists to be able to understand anything. They don't. There's really no point in ever going to do an economics degree, because you learn absolutely nothing in it except ideology. So one can't look at them. One has to look at what's actually in the press, the financial press, in this regard. And again, interestingly, what they've done is to refer to some of the statistics you expect the left to actually come out with. An article in May this year in the Financial Times pointed out that using our own language, that the switch to finance capital has meant an enormous increase in income for the fund managers and so forth. In other words, finance capital itself. And I hadn't realized until then what the income of a top fund manager could be, but it turned out that one estimate of the top fund manager last year was $3 billion. Well, his income was $3 billion. And I don't think many people were expected it to reach 3 billion. You know, maybe 300 million is enormous, but 3 billion. And the article points out that the top 50 financial institutions control almost $50 trillion in assets. The top 50 financial institutions.
How much? 50 trillion.
50 trillion, not billion, trillion in assets.
Zimbabwean dollars.
Pardon?
Zimbabwean.
Anyway, so we putting the man off.
Well, if you multiply that, of course, by a few billion, then you'll be Zimbabwean. I have no idea what the word is. Quadrillion, quintillion, I don't know. Yes, 10,000 hedge funds are estimated to account for 30 to 50% of all equity trading worldwide. The top 100 hedge funds control 60% of hedge fund assets. It points out that when there's a crisis, the authorities have to go to these guys, the hedge fund managers, in order to try and deal with it. So there's in fact a switch in power, which is part of the point. And finally, he points out that the 1,100 richest people in the world have almost twice the assets of the poorest 2.5 billion. In general, what they've been pointing out, which of course everybody knows, is the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer, and the middle class has been wiped out. But it's interesting that they are saying that. It's partly true that a number of these guys are actually liberal or left liberal. And so one shouldn't simply take them as representative politically of the whole class, because they actually were at one edge of it. You might not have thought that was the case. I quote in that article in Critique, the head of one of the biggest bond funds in the world, who actually makes that precise statement, the rich are getting richer and so forth, the middle class is getting wiped out, and says this simply can't go on. So, at the very least, one has to say, although they may not be wholly representative, that the class itself understands what is actually going on and realizes it cannot go on and it has to change. That in itself would justify an argument which says that this is a turning point. That's to say, leaving out the action of the working class, given this situation, the very fact that the ruling class realizes that their means of stability is being wiped out, means that they will have to change. That already is the case. And of course, I've quoted many times here one of the most startling statistics, which is that, of course, the total value of derivatives today is $596 trillion. Now, when I quoted the figure, or slightly different figure, it was $596 trillion as at the end of 2007, according to the Bank of International Settlements, in case you thought I made it up. When I quoted this figure in this debate with Bill Jeffries, he made the absurd remark that it was of no importance, because after all that somebody had to do to bet on exchanges was put down $1, and if you won, he would get $1,000, and if you lost, he would lose $1. Yes, and if you won, he didn't answer that question, of course. If you put down $1 and you're betting $1,000, as it were, and you win, you get $1,000. Now, if you magnify it, of course, what it would really mean is, because in fact, most of the time, this is not pure betting. It's companies insuring themselves against change. like in currencies. Now, so if you could imagine a company putting down $1 million because it's got, let's say, a container ship, or because its currency may suddenly change, or whatever it is, and it's insuring itself for another $1 billion, and the thing does go down, then of course it has to be paid out $1 billion. The insurance company's lost $1 billion. So in other words, the argument that you lose $1 only is just nonsense, because one side, of course, can in fact win an enormous amount. Now, in fact, because within the system, each institution tries to insure and reinsure itself, it doesn't just break down. I mean, if there are cases where people win substantial amounts of money, then of course that company is likely to reinsure itself with another, and so on and so on. So it's not likely the thing will break down like that. However, the problem doesn't arise in the particular instance of one group, person, institution, or whatever, or a number. The problem arises if there's an imbalance within that 596 trillion, which by now is more, of course. What happens if it becomes imbalanced? As to say, the attempt to lay off against one another isn't easily done, or in fact it's a sudden change, which is what happened in the case of the mortgages in the United States, the subprime mortgages, so-called. That's exactly what did happen, and it did cause an imbalance in the derivatives market, particularly in the in one particular sector, the credit swaps, which was 64 trillion. Now, dollars. What happens if there's an imbalance of that kind, let's say an enormous change? Well, then the whole thing becomes unbalanced, and God knows what is going to happen, which is why they couldn't control it, and they still can't control it. They don't know what's happening. It's not a question of saying the central banks know that there's $596 trillion and where it is. They don't know where it is. They didn't expect it. It happened, and they can't control it. It's quite clear they can't control it. And you only have to read the papers to realize they don't know what's happening. Why does one bank not want to lend to another bank? It's amazing. I haven't read on the Great Depression, but I didn't read there of how banks were afraid to lend to particular other banks. But now the biggest banks are afraid to lend to another of the biggest banks in case they won't get their money back. What's not surprising is that if the biggest bank, Citibank, in effect was close to bankruptcy, and it has had to be bailed out by one of the sovereign funds. So this figure is real and dangerous. And you don't have to be a genius to work out that at some point the equilibrium would break down. And it's not as if nothing was ever said about it. I think I've quoted before, Warren Buffett, the sage of capitalism, as they call him, the sage of Omaha, said in 2003, talking of these derivatives, which have gone up enormously in just the last few years. They were only invented in the 80s in this form. I quoted the actual figures as to how they've actually gone up, and you can see they've gone up very, very quickly. Anyway, now it's 596 trillion, and just into December 2005, it was 297 trillion. And you just go back a few years, it'd be very, very small. But in 2003, Warren Buffett said, even when it was considerably less, still running into hundreds of trillions, he said they're weapons of mass destruction. It's absolutely he in effect said this is crazy. Now, the question really shouldn't be a discussion of collateral debt obligations, CDOs, which have now died, which is what some people have been discussing. I'm not going to even attempt to go into that. The question shouldn't be that. The question is why? Why do we end up with this fantastic situation which would have to end in the kind of crisis we've got, the credit crunch and a crisis? Why is it there? And that's really what I'm trying to look at. and trying to point out that once we start to look at it, we realize this is really the end of the whole period since 1945. The working class hasn't acted and isn't likely to act at this point. It's taken much more, something like the form of 1929. If anybody read Galbraith's book on the Great Crash, well, you'll see that he ends by saying, well, it'll happen again. I remember reading that 30 years ago or something, just thinking, well, it's nuts. It isn't going to happen again like that. But the comparison is now with 1929. It was Engels who said that the crises are getting steadily worse, and of course, that was in fact true until the post-war period. So we've been through a long period of relative stability. Now, Marxism doesn't argue that capitalism is stable. Marxism wouldn't be Marxism if it was arguing that capitalism is stable and it can go on forever. Now, if you read one of the books on capitalism in the small pocketbook series you can put up after, you see that the argument there on capitalism is that capitalism can always solve its problems. That, in other words, because in the last 50 years, since the end of the war, it has managed to get out of its crises, the cycles have gone up and down, that many people simply say, well, okay, capitalism is here and it's going to be here forever, and it's managed to solve its problems. Well, that certainly isn't a Marxist argument. One could, of course, argue that Marxism is wrong, but just the argument, of course, I'm giving here is just the reverse. Marxism does argue that capitalism is inherently unstable. Obviously, in its mature phase, it would be less unstable than it's in its declining phase. But again, we argue that it isn't in its declining phase. So we have to argue what the instabilities are and how they have been solved over time, or not solved, at least put off over time, and why the present period is different. Now, in fact, I have argued this several times, but I'll just go over it fairly quickly. Capitalism, in general theory, stabilizes itself internally. Now, that's in contrast with a feudal society or the ancient mode of production, where force was absolutely crucial. Workers are not slaves, and they're not serfs. The ideology is internal. It's commodity fascism. It's not religion, which is really external. It's to the economic system. It's commodity fascism, which comes out of the nature of capital itself, out of the commodity. The commodity controls and it provides the ideology. In the second place, there is a reserve army of labour which controls the sale of labour power. Those are the two major controls. It's not the only aspect, but it's the two major controls which are within capitalism and were successful in controlling capital until it entered its declining phase. Of course, in its declining phase, commodity fascism no longer controls. It's been penetrated, let's say. Individuals, the working class, people working understand the nature of the ideology. They don't accept it, if only in terms of their everyday experience. They find that they don't accept the rule of the employer, of the capitalist. They don't accept the ideology which goes with it. Now, that has become more as generalized. It may come back, it may ebb and flow, but that now is the case. In the post-war period, the reserve army of labour was effectively abolished. I said from 45, what you actually had was an agreement to have full employment, and that in itself brought, that in itself was induced through the policy of going for growth. So again, that meant it wasn't possible to control the working class in the usual way. And although unemployment among the group of workers between 25 and 50. That's a small reserve army of labour. It's not very great, particularly not in the southeast of Britain. If you look at it overall, there's been a huge rise in the number of economically active, which one should use instead of as an indication of the real number of unemployed. However, the fact is that the central group of workers are still not governed in the same way as they were before the war. Nonetheless, since the reintroduction of finance capital, as I just indicated, the reserve army of labour was partially recreated. The logical force of what I've just said is that in the post-war period, although what one had was growth and a welfare state, the major means of control over the working class were greatly weakened. Now, you would expect these aspects to be weakened in any declining phase in any case. Now, if we actually look at the basis of change within capitalism as given by Marx, you can see that Marx refers to four more indications as to why capitalism can't control itself and would tend towards crises. Now, if one actually looks again at Marx, you'll see that he did expect a crisis. He did expect in 1857 that the crisis of 1857 would be sufficient to provoke a crisis. That didn't actually happen. It wasn't as if Marx just said capitalism has a mode of functioning and that's the way it is, and what will happen, which he does say in volume 1, is that you'll have increasing socialization of production on the one hand, and on the other hand, the ever smaller number of big capitals, which he does say. But he doesn't only say that. In the third volume, he points out that he says, to use his words, capitalism is senile, I use the word senile, under conditions where the rate of profit must fall because of rising organic composition of capital. And remember, at the time he was writing, the rate of profit was falling. So he did see the falling rate of profit as a crucial aspect. I've argued, and I would argue, that one can't use that, as some people do, as an automatic reason, or a reason for an automatic decline in capitalism. I don't think that's true. Any discussion of categories has to be discussed in relation to the movement of the class struggle. And in any case, it's much more complex than that, given the fact that Marx's theory of the rising organic composition of capital and the decline rate of profit goes along with rising productivity. And what he's actually arguing at this point is that capitalism reaches such a dead end that it stops increasing productivity in order to avoid a falling rate of profit. Well, one might argue, I think Ms. Shoris, someone said, does actually argue that for the present time. Anyway, that's one aspect of it. As I say, I think a lot of people have turned it into a fetishism, really, within Marxism. All they see is a declining rate of profit, and of course it becomes a whole mechanical system, which I think is absurd. But it is an aspect of the vulnerability of capitalism. The second aspect of it is the question of disproportionality. In volume 2 of Capital, Marx discusses the relationship between Department 1 and Department 2, the producer goods and consumer goods, and he shows the way it changes over time. Now, in fact, if you look at the way he's changing it year by year, you can see that he's fixed the figures. There's no question he actually fixed the figures, so it would last over a number of years. If you stop fixing the figures, they break down very, very quickly. Let's say take all the necessary assumptions, rising organic composition of capital, and the interrelationship of sectors, then you find it just doesn't work. Now, the conclusion isn't that capitalism doesn't work. I mean, he was trying to show the way in which capitalism can work given certain assumptions, but you have to add those assumptions. And it's been, again, so if those assumptions don't actually operate, then the interrelationship between the sectors becomes problematic. So that was the second aspect of it, disproportionality. And of course, that's what actually Lenin based himself on, and the Bolsheviks in general, Preobrazhensky did. The third aspect, underconsumption, Marx explicitly says, and that's very often quoted, that in the end, the reason for crisis is based on the limited consumption of the working class, or the interrelationship between growing levels of capital on the one side and the limited wages on the other. The actual way he puts it, I mean, if you actually read what he actually says, doesn't actually support a simple underconsumption statement. I'm not going to go into it, but basically his actual words are such that it supports the viewpoint that the fact that labor power is paid a wage, and that you have, on the other hand, surplus value does lead to a situation which is uncontrollable, as it were. But it doesn't lend itself to a simple statement of underconsumption as the monetary review school actually adopted. Anyway, those are the three aspects of capitalism which have to be contained over time for it to go on. Now, in mature capitalism, there actually wasn't the same problem, because in the first instance, you had surplus labor coming in from the countryside on a considerable scale. Reserve army was being recreated in any case. Wages were kept down. But at the same time, you had very rapid industrial growth. It's only when you go into a declining phase that you begin to have a problem. You don't have the same rate of growth. You don't have the same reserve army of labor. The rate of profit fell. This is what actually happened. Now, the question then is, how did capitalism maintain itself over time? What were the solutions that it actually adopted? Now, if we actually think about it, there are not many solutions it could adopt. However successful they were. The first solution adopted, and I think we all know this, of course, was imperialism. And a famous statement by Rhodes, which said, unless we go for imperialism, we will have civil war, is of course very, very well known. But it was, in fact, a highly successful strategy. The only problem was, of course, that it was barbaric and did lead to the First World War. It did lead to a situation which was politically uncontrollable. So the second aspect, which has been much more important for the present time, has been simply war. Now, war, from this point of view, and of course imperialism played this role, or has played this role, has been a brilliant solution for capitalism. It's really ideal. Because of course it takes care of the other aspects where capitalism is contradictory quite quickly. Since the state runs the army, in effect you have nationalized war, even though today there are a number of mercenary armies and certain aspects of outsourcing in Iran. Nonetheless, it's a state which pays. And the army, although I say there are private armies as well, but in general, the American army, which is of course what we have to talk about, the American army is a nationalized form. And what has been the case is that in general, if a country, and that applies of course always to the dominant country, which is the United States, is able to convince its citizens that it ought to go to war, then those citizens are prepared for sacrifices. In other words, they keep their income down, pay for it, or whatever. Taxes go up. They accept that. That happened obviously during the First and Second World Wars, and it has happened ever since 1945. So it provides the ideology, effectively, which allows a shift of income away from the working class. And at the same time, the arms sector is able, of course, to take care of demand, both in terms of working class, that's to say it can order food, and does order food on an enormous scale, say in Iraq, clothing and so forth. So at some level, consumption is taken care of. And since the arms sector fits very well into Department 1, it takes care of the disproportionality, that's the overproduction of Department 1. And again, because the arms sector is very well paid, and I think everybody knows the examples of how in the United States the companies involved have been paid, overpaid, and very often paid for not doing anything. I mean, the example of Halliburton having been paid $3 billion for supplying meals which it never supplied is well known. So, but it's not as if Halliburton is the first company which did that. That's just normal in the arms sector. Or, the very well known example of a screwdriver which cost $1,500 is another very famous example which came out in Congress. So the rate of profit goes up. And maybe, as it were, you could abstract bad reasons, but it goes up. So war is absolutely ideal, particularly at the present time when the United States, and in fact the United States, is able to simply order missile production and then declare within 3 months that the missiles are out of date and needs new missiles. Not just new missiles, but bigger and better missiles. So you get permanent demand involved. That's, as it were, an ideal situation. So war, from this point of view, is absolutely ideal. The problem with war, of course, because all the aspects of stability have their own limits. The problem with war is, of course, that people don't want to go on fighting. And that's obviously true in the United States again today. It was obviously true in the case of Vietnam. And after a period of time, taxes really do have to go up. And if people don't, in the end, don't like the war, well, the politicians are then in trouble. On top of that, the capitalist class itself doesn't like paying taxes. And it tries to offload it in the working class, but in the end has to pay a certain amount, corporations have to pay. And if the war becomes very costly, well, it no longer is profitable to have a war. So wars have their limits. I'll come to its expression at present time. The third aspect of stability, I mean, political economic stability, is social democracy, or the welfare state. Now that again was highly successful for a time, roughly from 1945 until 1975, let's say. And that was, in fact, based on war. That's to say, it was possible to have a high rate of growth and an end to unemployment, but at the same time provide a welfare state for the working class. That did, in fact, serve the purpose, but it only did so for a limited period of time. The reason was, if one actually looks at it, the working class was, of course, controlled by a series of features at the time. So when interrelated with the class struggle, what one finds is that Stalinism was crucial in controlling the working class in the West, obviously the East, but you're talking about the West. Stalin was crucial in this respect. Social democracy itself played a role, but important role, but social democracy became largely dependent on Stalinism in this period. And of course, by 1968, it was in rapid decline. Stalinism was in rapid decline. The events of 1968 showed that. Secondly, the previous history which had controlled the working class, to say, having gone through fascism, the Great Depression, the World War, was no longer able to control the working, because you now had people who hadn't been through the World War or the Great Depression. So the previous history which was controlling the working class, which allowed social democracy to play its role, was no longer there. So 1968 wasn't an accident. It didn't just happen because students in Berkeley decided to throw over the traces, or because they thought their possibility of jobs was low or whatever. So, and as far as I understand, unlike some people in there, the decline in rate of profit which did take place in this period really was because the conditions had changed, the working class was acting. It wasn't just that the wages they were demanding higher wages, they were demanding better conditions, strikes were going on. It really did threaten the system. It didn't immediately threaten the system, although of course we can say certain aspects did, but it was clear that if you did not restore the reserve army of labor and try to restore commodity fascism, capitalism was in trouble. So they had to abolish social democracy. The change in 75 to finance capital was predicated on that. It was a deliberate switch to finance capital as a means of control at that point, because the old means of control was no longer working in the same way. Now, of course, after 78, the switch to finance capital to a degree has worked. But it and the period from 45 to 78 was very much dependent on the Cold War itself. Now, I talked about war. The Cold War was really the ideal form of war. That's to say, you have a war which never takes place. In that case, you can have lots of rockets, you can declare them redundant within 2 or 3 months and just keep doing that and never have to actually fight a war. Then, of course, if you never really have to fight a war, you don't have a population which is against war, because it never has to fight. So you have a much longer period, as it were, to maintain your strategy. The problem with that, of course, was that the Cold War was indeed coming to an end. The Soviet Union itself was coming to an end. And I have to say, I don't think the bourgeoisie realized what it was doing. When it was triumphalist after 1990, I don't think it understood anything of what was going on. It had actually shot itself in the foot. Well, from its point of view, it would have been far better the Soviet Union had actually continued. It had an ideal enemy there, because it was quite clear to the majority of the working class in the United States, correctly, that the Soviet Union was awful. It's the last thing they wanted, and therefore the ideology of control in the United States actually worked. It may not have worked everybody, it certainly worked in the United States, and for good reason it worked. So it was possible to control the working class under a certain, but it came to an end. So the Cold War, which acted as the major means of stability, together with the other aspects, but the Cold War was underpinning it, had come to an end. What they were left with was no longer social democracy. They now had only finance capital. The policy has been called neoliberalism. I don't call it that. It's just a policy of finance capital. Policy of finance capital is and has been to switch to control by finance capital, to the use of the market, to the restoration of the reserve army of labor, to the use of money, privatization, and so forth. That's its logic. And it isn't that people dreamed up this idea. Thatcher certainly didn't dream it up. It simply happened. As her policy failed, because her policy failed from one end to another. She switched to whatever was immediately accessible and possible, and ended up, of course, with very high levels of real unemployment. And again, we know that in Britain she switched people who were unemployed into incapacity benefit, so as to avoid showing the real levels of unemployment. So finance capital, by accident, and not really by design, but by accident, ended up with a kind of sub-ideology which it implemented over the world. And for a time, it did actually work, again, for good reason. The fact is that Stalinism didn't work, social democracy also didn't work. Now, one of the themes which I'll bring up tomorrow again, which I have to raise here, is that capitalism as I've been indicating, is a system of its own kind, and it has a series of features which have to exist. If they don't exist, capitalism begins to malfunction. The Soviet Union always malfunctioned, part of the same kind of reason. And that is, if you actually have social democracy, you don't have a reserve army of labor. You have major trade unions controlling to a considerable degree the pace of the way people are working within factories, which was in fact the case. The incentive system is blunted or can even be destroyed. Now, you end up with a dilemma. Anybody who's on the left ends up with a dilemma because you fight for better conditions in the working class. But if you actually do that, well, if you say a worker working there, well, why should you work harder? Why would you want to work harder for the capitalist anyway? The only reason you do that is because you know that if you don't do that, you'll be sacked, or you won't be promoted, or your wage will go down, or be static, or whatever. The only reason to work is because it is, as Marx called it, a system of economic force. Economic force. Now, if the economic force isn't there or is blunted, you just won't work very hard. Now, that would be the automatic feature, and that was the case. Productivity then went down. That was particularly true of Britain. Now, that is not sustainable over time. That's not a system which is sustainable over time. It would have to break down. If you put it more clearly in philosophical terms, there are only two essences. There's capitalism and socialism. Anything in between just doesn't work. It can work for a time, but it must break down. There are only two possibilities in the world, capitalism and socialism. Anything in between is not going to work, it'll break down. Stalinism was in that position and broke down. But it's true of social democracy as well. It cannot work. It's not just that we oppose social democracy, it can't work. They attack us, for talking of socialist communist society as a utopia. But their conception actually is a utopia. It can't work, it had to break down, it broke down. Social democracy ended, effectively, for a very good reason. So, in other words, by the year 2000, we can say the strategy of social democracy had come to an end. Stalinism was dead or dying. I don't know what term you want to use for China or Cuba. So the two major strategies, political strategies, social democracy and Stalinism, which was taking form of the Cold War, particularly in relation to capitalism, had come to an end. Politically it had come to an end, economically it had come to an end. So of course by March 2000 you actually had the downturn, which in effect what's now happening is a continuation of it. If you read critique, you know I actually expected the downturn of 2000 to continue, or this weak upturn, and that's in fact at first what did happen. The Iraq War changed that. Now, some people have other viewpoints as to why there was an upturn, but as far as I can see, it was largely the Iraq War. I've given the figures here before, but briefly, if you look at, say, arms expenditure as a percentage of GDP reached its peak in peacetime peak of 8.5% in 1986 under Reagan, when they had the doctrine of the squeeze in relation to the USSR. From there on, as it went down, so by 1997 it was down to 3% of GDP, and it had gone right down. Well, of course, there was a tremendous pressure on lowering taxation, which, say, is an inevitable pressure under these conditions. And of course, you couldn't sustain an ideology of fighting a war which didn't exist, since the Soviet Union had come to an end. Thereafter it went up slightly, but it's particularly under Bush that it's gone up. So from 2003, it's practically doubled. The physical numbers have doubled, so it's gone up from roughly $300 billion to $600 billion. That's roughly, there are figures for it. But if you look at its percentage of GDP, it's gone up from about 3% to 4.5%. So it's nowhere near the previous figure, which was actually reached because Reagan, if you remember, went for the squeeze, let's say, raised the amount being spent on arms in relation to the Soviet Union. But he didn't really do it. In any case, he was an idiot, so I'm sure it doesn't make a difference what he really thought. But anyway, he didn't really do it because he wanted to squeeze the USSR. They had gone for it, remember, because there was what looked like a precipitous downturn in 1981, and then they just suddenly went for this doctrine of the squeeze and increased arms production very, very considerably. So the point I'm trying to make is that can't actually reach the previous figure, 8%, 8.5% of GDP. In any case, it probably would have to be higher to stabilize the United States. They've actually doubled the amount because of the Iraq War. I don't think they expected that to happen, that they'd have to end up spending so much money on it. They clearly didn't expect it. And one of the consequences of the fact they didn't expect it and simply went on spending the money was that there was not just a boom, but a boom of a much greater intensity and extension than they had ever expected. That's why we've had this vast expansion in China, India, the third world, and you now have a position where the IMF is no longer in control. The IMF is no longer in control because all these countries have been able to repay the IMF. If you read the papers, you see that the question is, what now is the role of the IMF? Whereas formerly, remember, in the earlier period, that were the heyday of restored finance capitalism, they were instructing third world countries to reduce the welfare provisions they had, reduce money spent on education, etc., which was done very well, as it were, in South Africa, which was probably its best student. But in the recent period, the IMF no longer had the power to actually do it. The countries simply didn't owe them the money. There, of course, are a number of countries which do, but the majority have paid back the debt. Remember, although Argentina has a debt and doesn't have a debt to the IMF, it actually paid it off. So, the controls were effectively reduced in this very latest period, not because they intended it, but because it went out of control. They didn't realize that they'd go for this vast expansion. They didn't want to go for this expansion. When they switched to finance capital, they were quite clear that they didn't want the old form of growth because it was dangerous. They were being challenged. The working class was challenging them. They didn't do it. And I therefore say they will not do it ever again. They will not go for social democracy ever again. They realize it's far too dangerous because it strengthens the working class. It creates potential the working class can form as a class and overthrow capitalism. They saw that and they're just not going to do it. So in the present crisis, the present downturn, they will not go for that strategy. They will not go for growth. They will not reflate. And you can see that again in the way they regard inflation. In spite of this downturn, they regard inflation as the major issue. So what I've said is you've got, as it were, coming together the political and economic. Politically, the strategies which have been adopted in the past, Stalinism and social democracy, have come to an end. They've reached their limits. The political economic forces which have been used, imperialism and war, have also reached their limits for the present time. Again, that's not simply a question of political economics. It's quite clear that they were not able to reintroduce conscription, the draft, into the United States, although they would have preferred to do it. They can't get people to simply go to war. They can't conduct another war. They may drop bombs in Iran, but they can't actually send people to Iran. If they were to do it, the system would really be rocking. They know that, so they can't do it. They've reached the limit, as it were. And that's why I began by quoting a number of people who are at the very top of capital who are saying this can't go on. And one of the points they make is the middle class is being wiped out. Now that's an incidental and unplanned result, of course, of letting finance capital rip. You will get the rich getting richer, poor getting poorer, and the middle class getting wiped out. Because what you are getting is a number of features which automatically lead the middle class getting wiped out. One of them is the increasing proletarianization of the so-called middle class. It's very often, very obvious to those who are teachers or academics. You know, we would have thought that academics would have to clock in from 9 to 5, but that in fact is actually happening. And they are being proletarianized. They're being proletarianized directly in their form. There's teachers, lawyers, and so forth. It's extending on the previous middle class. And capital has regarded it as its duty to build up a middle class. If you read their strategies as to the third world, there's always a reference to the need to build a middle class. It's not just in Parliament. You can read what the big companies involved, like Rio Tinto Zinc or Lonro or whatever it's saying in relation to Africa. They're quite conscious they have to build up a middle class in order to stabilize those countries. But the nature of finance capital was that it reversed it, and it has been reversing. Of course, the second aspect of the increasing use of money, the insistence on money, and the insistence, in fact, of using commodity treasuries and means of control, is that those in the state sector get squeezed. So, in other words, the middle class dependent on the state sector just gets squeezed, its standard of living goes down. So, and in general, that tends to affect the whole middle class. So, it's squeezed both in terms of its income and in its actual position. Now again, I quoted it, and they're very well aware that what this is doing is polarizing the society. Which brings us, as it were, back to 1896 and Bernstein. People remember that it was Bernstein who said Marx was wrong. He said, he actually misinterpreted Marx. He said, Marx says the rich will get richer, the poor will get poorer, and the middle class will get wiped out. In fact, he says it's the reverse. Polarization is being reduced, the middle class is being built up, and so the final aim is nothing, the movement is everything. Remember, that's what he said. Well, if he were alive today, he obviously would have to say the reverse. It may have taken 100 years to make it absolutely obvious that he was wrong, but he clearly is wrong today. It's the restoration, as it were, attempt to restore capital controls, the forms of capital, which has led to this, but in particular to the restoration of finance capital. Now, some people appear to be confused as to what finance capital is, since I've given this talk, there's been various questions. There's financialization, or financial capital, that's one thing. In any circuit of capital, you have to have, of course, production and circulation. And part of circulation is the money aspect, the transference of the commodity into money. Now that's financial capital. Now that is necessary. It's a necessary feature of the capital circuit. It changes to finance capital when finance capital takes control of the financial sector and becomes dominant over the whole thing. That's what happened in the 1870s in Britain. As I said and written, Lenin and Hillel were actually wrong when they were discussing it. It happened in Britain. It didn't, in fact, happen in the same way in France and Germany and Japan. And you can see it today. France, Germany, and Japan are industrial powers. Britain and America are finance capitalist powers. They didn't actually understand the process or understand even the history of Britain, for that matter. Anyway, that's a side issue. The point is finance capital established control over capital, and it has its own goals. Finance capital is abstract capital. It is capital abstracted from production. It can exist anywhere and everywhere. And it can, as Hillel pointed out, organize capital itself. So it establishes an organized, conscious basis for that capitalist class, which it didn't have in the same way before. So it is different from financial capital in being abstract capital, in being an organizing capital, and in being, above all, short-termist. It's not interested in production itself. If it could abolish production, which is absurd, it would. But the ethos in Britain today, as everybody knows, is that the money sector is crucial. All we need is the city, and Britain will be wonderful. Money is money, and that's all that counts. Money actually makes money. That's the line, and people actually believe it. Money makes money. Where else does it come from? It comes from money. So that is the effect and the nature of finance capital. Short-termism means, of course, that it destroys. It would tend to destroy, and we can see it in Britain, we see it in the United States, tend to destroy capital itself, because it would tend to destroy productive capital. That is what has happened in the past. It's not surprising that we go for war and destroy capital in that process. It may be unconscious, but that is the nature of finance capital. Now, that has been a strategy since the late 1970s. Again, you can see from these figures, it's reached its end. You simply cannot have an overhang of $596 trillion and not expect it to explode. It's not that at any one time it is immediately exploding, but this equilibrium must arise. It must happen at some point. Now, that Warren Buffett wasn't stupid, obviously, one of the richest men, or if not the richest in the world. He knows what he's talking about, and he says it's a weapon of mass destruction. But why did they go for it? What was, as it were, this end process we've ended up in? It is that when the rich get richer, when wealth piles up on one side, when money piles up in this way, when the managers are re-enfranchised, which is what's happened, or enfranchised in the capitalist class, getting these absurd, and this they call it in Spanish times, absurd sums of $3 billion a year as income, then what you've got is an enormous pile-up of money on one side and nowhere to invest it. Well, where were they going to invest it in? During the Cold War, given the nature of the Cold War and the constant expansion, that was possible. It's much more limited today, and this vast expansion would make even it struggle. So where do you put it? Well, we've seen what they tried to do in the first period until 2000. They put it into Southeast Asia, and it exploded. You had the long-term capital management fund, it exploded. They went for a dot-com industry, or whatever we call it, and it exploded. And that then led to a downturn on March 2000. In this latest period, they put the money in part into China largely, if they put it anywhere else, various parts of the world, but that is relatively limited. And so they put the money precisely into these derivatives. If you look at why there's this enormous inflation in commodities, in the oil price, food prices, and so forth, it may be partly because of shortage, but I personally don't think there is any shortage. It is very largely a result of the need of big capital to find somewhere to put their money. It's speculation. It wasn't an accident when the finance ministers met and they discussed this issue of whether the oil price, which they were particularly worried about, was so high. What happened was Britain and the United States said it was a shortage of supply. Germany and France, Japan said, no, it's speculation. So they set up a committee to discuss it. That was their solution. But you can see what the difference was. You expect that to be that difference. That's the difference between the speculators and the industrial countries, really. So that's the way it actually went. That's what you expect to happen, and it did happen. They split along those lines. So the money has gone into speculation, but there's a limit to it, because you can't go on simply putting money into money like that. At some point, it bursts. And that's what's happening. So in other words, what we're in, which appears to be a kind of disembodied inflation on the one hand, and on the other hand, a credit crunch combined with an economic downturn, is all one thing. It's a result of the end of finance capitalism, a point where finance capitalism has become cannibalistic itself, where it's had to invest in itself, take over itself, which simply can't go on because money doesn't make money, which therefore has taken this inflationary aspect on the one hand. And on the other hand, where wages are static, where the other aspects of the problems of capital, or countries of capital, operate, it's obvious that there isn't a place to invest, but on the other hand, demand does go down, has gone down. So in the United States, there's no question that the economy is sinking. I don't think nobody questions that. The only question that there is how deep the downturn will be. As I quoted, Rubini said it's the mother of all downturns. Well, he's proved more right than any of the others. I say the economists, of course, think it's a downturn today and tomorrow it'll be an upturn. It's a normal cycle. But for what I'm arguing, that isn't the case. The comparator, which is used is 1929. That's a reasonable comparator. What is different from 1929, of course, is that governments will and have to intervene and have been intervening. And what must necessarily change is the attitude to capitalism, and that is already happening. You don't, Punishment isn't printing that by accident. The attitude to capitalism is changing among the population as a whole, and even among capital itself, because this strategy has come to its end. But obviously, if people are being dispossessed, which they are, of their houses on a large scale, and the politicians, particularly in Britain, are doing absolutely nothing about it. Politicians who claim to be social democratic one way or another are allowing, 30 to 50,000 a year, something, 30, 50,000 a year being dispossessed of the house. And they're doing, although they're talking, they're doing absolutely nothing about it. And the logical way it's going on, of course, you're going to have a lot more people actually walking the streets. And nothing is happening. The thing that we can predict is that the downturn will continue and get deeper. And of course there will be an upturn eventually. For the usual reasons, there'll be an upturn. But the IMF is predicting, of course, a downturn which will lead to a weak upturn. So if the IMF would give a more optimistic version, you can read into it what it will really be. But we can expect, let's say, that downturn to continue, be transferred from the so-called credit crunch into a real downturn of the real economy, which of course is already there, but it will become considerably deeper over time. What Rubini's referred to and various others have referred to is this vicious circle. The downturn goes on, people are dismissed, can't pay their mortgages, the mortgage crisis re-erupts, people can't pay their credit card bills or the overdrafts, the banks get into much bigger trouble. What then? That obviously is happening and is going to get much worse. That's been said 100 times over. So the question isn't whether this is going to happen. Obviously is happening and will happen, and the downturn will get deeper. The question is, how will the state react? How will governments react? That's the only unpredictability in this. The political economic unpredictability isn't there. It might be more unpredictable if the working class is acting, but it's not acting. I'm sure eventually it will, but it's not acting at the moment. It's potentially there, and the ruling class can see that, and for that reason they realize that they have to intervene. But that's the question. How far are they going to be intervened? How much will they actually take over, nationalize? Remember, in Britain, which is, and this is quite typical, had this ridiculous debate as to whether they should take over Northern Rock. And the governor of the Bank of England was talking of moral hazard. Absolutely ridiculous term. Moral hazard. You think for the term there's some morality involved. In fact, the term moral hazard is just saying they shouldn't take over anything like this because they allow the shareholders to get away with it. That's what it's saying. Whereas what you ought to do is bankrupt the shareholders. So in other words, they didn't want to take over Northern Rock because it was the responsibility of the technical owners. Private property is sacrosanct, and those who had the private property should go bankrupt, and that's the end of it. Of course, that's absurd, and the whole concept of moral hazard is utterly ridiculous. But anyway, you'd expect that from those who support private enterprise. So, the logic of that position would have been they would have left Northern Rock to go, would have gone bankrupt, and the whole banking system could have collapsed. It's absolutely ridiculous. You can't understand how stupid the British government is. Any idiot from who had simply an education in reading some of the financial pages, would realize that you had to take it over long before they did, not because you wanted to salvage the shareholders or anything like that, but because it would run right through the financial system. So they were forced to take the thing over. But that's an indication of their lack of understanding. That's why I don't know. I don't know how the governments will now react. That's what's unpredictable. Potentially, you could see that they would have to nationalize a fair number of banks, and question, will they nationalize very big firms which are threatening to go bankrupt? Of course, you know, in the United States, General Motors and Ford are pretty close to bankruptcy. And it's not at all clear that they'll actually avoid it. You know, one division, effectively, of General Motors did declare bankruptcy. Delphi, which was their parts division, was separated out a few years ago and went bankrupt. It was allowed to go bankrupt. So, was allowed to go bankrupt. Given the iconic status of General Motors, of course, they may not nationalize, they may just give it money without telling anybody they're giving it money. But that's the question. What are they actually going to do? And say, that's unpredictable, because that depends on the class struggle, the political forces at work. So we don't know that, but we do know what's happening with the economy and the way the economy is going down. So what I've argued, therefore, is that both politically and economically, it's a very different position today. And above all, what this represents is the end of Stalinism, the end of social democracy as modes of control, as modes of stabilization. Capitalism is now highly unstable. Thank you. Thanks. I apologize for having to come back in, but that's partly because in the past I find large number of people speak. There's no way on earth that I can reply to them, because I can't possibly remember the detail even if I write it down. Unfortunately, I've hurt my thumb, so I can't write either, so I'm kind of stuck with it. I agree with a lot of what was said by Rees. On the question of wars and the possible new strategy, first a new strategy, it's true, that is what I'm saying, there is no new strategy. There isn't. But I'm saying more than that, there is actually no possible new strategy. It's not that they couldn't find one, they don't want it. They don't want to reintroduce long-term growth. They might want war, but they can't actually go for war today. Maybe they can go for war in 10 years' time, but they can't go for it now. It's just not an option. Chris is absolutely right. What happens to the United States capital happens to world capital. The idea that because the United States is declining, other countries are going to take over and become whatever, and take over the burden as well as the United States, is simply wrong. There is no comparison. No country compares with the United States. The United States is 25% technically of GDP, but if you just think about some of the companies involved, the innovations, or whatever it is, it's the United States. You don't have another Intel. And the two companies compete are Intel and AMD. That's all. You don't have any other chip, crucial chip in the computer. That's it. You can go right through it. You look at the pharmaceutical companies. Yeah, there are many pharmaceutical companies, but the really biggest influential, with also the far biggest market, is the United States. Just go through this, and it's still dominant. It's dominant, in fact, although it has sent a certain amount of industry to China. It's dominant in industry, and it is overwhelmingly dominant in finance capital, and finance capital rules the world. There's no way around that. So its decline is world decline. There's no question of that. On top of that, if you actually look at it, where is the investment going on a large scale? The United States. Okay, they put some money into China, but if you look at the overall flow of capital, where does third world middle class capital go? The United States. Where does British overseas capital go? The United States. Where does any wealthy capitalist, or any capitalist, let's say, who's got excess capital and wants to put it away and be safe, the United States. In a sense, the United States is world capitalism. There is no competitor in that respect. It has individual competitors in certain aspects. It's true that Germany is the biggest exporter in the world, and it's become increasingly dominant. It was dominant before, it was challenged by Japan, but it's become dominant again in custom-made machine tools, machine tool industry. You think of Germany, you think of the best cars, you think of Germany and so on. That's true, but it's limited. The United States is the dominant power. It's dominant because finance capital, which it controls, is dominant anyway, apart from anything else. Can you get wars between these countries? Absolutely not. It's absolutely ridiculous to think that France is going to fight the United States or Germany will fight the United States. It's impossible. It's impossible technically, as I say, in terms of war terms, but it's also impossible even without war. Just consider it. Where is Germany and Japan and France's biggest market? The United States. Are they really going to antagonize it, lose their market, go right, sink right down? Impossible. All right, you can say there's a level of competition between companies, but increasingly, as Mike rightly points out, you get this fantastic level of integration now between the different countries. The idea that you're going to get a restoration, or as some people have put it, to competition between capitalist powers as before 1914 is absurd. The only competitor to a limited degree of what actually is Russia, which is actually outside this system. So to a degree there is that, but it's not really a competitor, it's really dependent more than anything else. The fact is, it's largely dependent on its sale of gas and oil to the West. The price of it is certainly going to go down, go down enormously. So I don't see world competition as having any great meaning. Of course, you have a certain limited amount of it. But in terms of the way we have read about it in the past, before 1940, before 1914, it's out of the question. You actually look at the figures of these different countries. All right, we'll talk about China tomorrow, but just give one figure for China. GDP of the United States is 13 trillion. GDP of China was 1.3 billion people. It's 2.5. There's no comparison. Look at India, which some papers keep talking about. It's 0.8. There's just no competition. It's ridiculous to even think of it that way. It's not there. The United States remains dominant, the world remained dominant for some time. It is a declining power, and it is declining, but in large part it is an expression, as Chris rightly says, it is an expression of the decline of capitalism itself. If you're going to have a decline in capitalism, it will always express itself through the particular country which is the dominant power. Before, when Lenin was talking about decline, it was really the decline of Britain, the British Empire, and it was an expression of capitalism declining. The United States took over. There's no other power that will take over. Okay, we'll talk about it tomorrow, but there's no other power. That's just out of the question. In regard to the question of strategy, I think there is no strategy, that's right. But there actually is no strategy. Now, one can have a series of short-term things, like you can extend credit, of course. They can nationalize a certain number of banks. They could use, in principle, they could use Northern Rock as a way of extending mortgages. It's perfectly possible for the government to pump, it's already pumped huge sums of money into the banking system, pump even more money into the banking system. Yeah, it's perfectly possible to do it. But there's a limit to which they will go in that. If they were prepared to go back to social democracy, they'll have another strategy. But it can only not, that itself as strategy has failed, as it were. It's worked for a time and they had to abandon it. But for that reason, they won't go for it. So there isn't actually another. That's why it actually is a turning point. The logic of the present situation actually is that the working class has to come onto the stage. Now, Chris Gray raised the question of fascism. Well, it's true. When I said, well, what is going to happen then? Leaving out the immediate political thing, which I'll just come to in a second, the result of a system which is in disequilibrium and crisis, in which there's no solution provided, logically, you think of it in dialectical terms, is that instead of a supersession occurring, or instead of interpenetration occurring, the poles pull apart. In other words, disintegration. You had that in Russia. That's what you already have that, in fact, in the world today. You have geographic separation very obviously occurring. That small countries declare independence everywhere, it tries to pull apart. Now, insofar as it goes down, that increases. You get economic separation between the different sectors, which is already beginning to occur. You get polarization between the classes. That's as logical. It obviously isn't going to go to the extremes as it did in Russia, where you end up having to work on your own plot as the only means of survival. But the logic is one of disintegration. One of the aspects, of course, of disintegration is what we see in Britain, large-scale existence of crime increasing because people have nothing else to do, or in South Africa. I mean, when you have 25,000 murders, officially 50,000 rapes, and in fact very many more rapes than you can think of, where average age of life expectation is below 40, which is now happening in the third world, where majority of the population don't work as a can't because you no longer talk of reserve army of labour because there is no army of labour. You have whatever 60% unemployment. It already exists in the third world and one could expect it to extend. Okay, so that seems to me to be the economic result, or the economic result. The question is, politically, what is likely to happen? I take it that you don't actually mean fascism itself. I don't know, maybe you do. I don't think fascism can ever recur. It was itself a specific result in particular circumstances, and without Stalinism to assist it, it can't exist. Fascism, after all, involved the mass organization of the middle class or the petty bourgeoisie. Its party was the petty bourgeoisie. There is no petty bourgeoisie in Britain or whatever. Maybe in a few countries there might be. It's out of the question in that form. That doesn't stop there being an authoritarian solution, which I take it to be. Yeah, I think undoubtedly that's there. Probability, in fact, of various authoritarian solutions. Because I didn't mention this because I spoke too long. It's quite clear that if the political solutions, the political economic solutions, are not able to operate, something else has to give. And if you actually look at the parliamentary systems, whether in Britain or France or the United States or Italy, they're quite clearly breaking down. When a large percentage of the population refuses to vote, it's not just that they prefer to go and get drunk, which seems to be the standard procedure in Britain. It's not just that. It's because there's no point in voting. What's the point of voting for three parties which are identical? So why? Okay, Conservative Party is to the left of the Labour Party, but everybody knows what that really means. Everybody knows what that really means. So what's the point? So that already is a major thing. And of course, in the United States, that's been true for a very long time, that the substantial proportion of the population, probably, not officially, I think it's roughly half, but since nobody knows the number of people who are not actually registered, and since they don't force people to register, the number is almost certainly higher. And then you add the number of the population who can't be citizens. So a minority of the population actually votes. So that's what it boils down to in the United States. And in part it's because they can't vote, and in part it's because who cares? I mean, what does it make who is president? And obviously, if you love Obama, they will say something else. But I mean, there is quite clearly, there's not that much difference. There is a difference, but not that much difference between Obama and McCain. So, anyway, the point is that the political system is cracking. It's been cracking for some time. People have contempt for it. It's one of the arguments I've been having. That today, the word democracy doesn't look too good. So I think it's true. Under these circumstances, an authoritarian solution is actually very possible. Technically, by the way, Nick, Reagan did not open up the dollar to being exported overseas. the US dollar and the Canadian dollar were worldwide currencies for as long as I know, and certainly since 1945. I don't know what happened before, but you could always write, if you had a US account, you could always write a dollar check. I know it's critique, you could always do that, and we used to get it like that, and we had an account like that. But it's true. The country which did end exchange controls was Britain, but not the United States, which didn't have it anyway, which was the world controlling power, where the dollar was the international currency. So that just actually was the case. And finally, just on your point about the change having come in 75, it's very true that the strategy changed, as I said, to finance capital. But the Cold War was still going on. The Labour Party was still there. Social democracy hadn't reached the depths which it has today, where it really has no meaning at all. The welfare state wasn't taken to pieces at that point. It was later that actually happened. So the end of the strategies, although Swiss finance capital is very, very important, is really only later, really around about now. And to say that in 2001 it was shallow, I don't know about that. What do we mean by shallow? Because you raised then the whole question of what a downturn is. We are not going to get a downturn like the United States had in 1929. The state will step in. We will not get a situation where the GDP goes down to some fraction of what it was. That just will not happen. That isn't on the card. In fact, it may not even be a technical recession the way they idiotically define it. You actually look at the United States. They define in terms of GDP. What on earth is GDP? Have you ever looked at these figures, what they really mean? In Marxist terms, of course, we reject it because it includes productive and unproductive capital. What was one of the things that Bill Jeffries got wrong when he said you simply can call prices values. You can't. If you want to do that, you can call it that, but the components are quite different. So what then is 2%, 4%, minus 2%? What does it actually mean? It may not mean very much. Now, in the case of the United States, let's assume it means something. You have to remember there's an expansion of the workforce in the United States by roughly 2%. Unless it grows by 2%, you get rising unemployment. That's the result. So in fact, if it has plus 1%, it's actually got a real downturn going on. Or even plus one?
Bourgeoisie is not bothered about unemployment.
No, I'm not talking about whether they're bothered or not bothered. We're talking about how shallow the thing is. I'm just pointing out it's quite complicated when you actually start to work the thing out. Now, the unproductive sector can be expanded, and the productive sector reduced, which is what actually happens. You can have a whole series of aspects of the thing which covers the whole thing up. What you've got to look at actually is the central value-producing sectors, what's actually happening to them, and then look and say what is really happening. Now, if General Motors is in trouble, which it is, Ford is in trouble, Chrysler is in trouble, well, what is happening in the United States? Okay, you can say Japanese companies are doing relatively well. They are. And you can say Boeing isn't doing too badly. Now, of course, they say Boeing's doing well, and who would think it would do well? 25 airlines have gone bankrupt, and Boeing is doing well. Well, you can see it can't do well if all these companies are going bankrupt. Well, who will demand their airplanes? You imagine, you have no airplanes and there's still demand for planes. It doesn't make sense. But that is logic. So obviously Boeing will be in trouble. It's not in trouble right now, and Airbus isn't in trouble right now. But the logic where we're going is that it will be. But it may not show up in GDP statistics just because of the way it's calculated. I don't know if you ever looked at it, but you ought to look at the way it's calculated. It's just absurd. Just briefly, I completely agree with Sandy. In Britain, you might imagine that there'd be a demand for protectionism in certain quarters, say sections of the Labour Party or whatever. But Britain today is so dependent on finance capital, which is international, that it dare not do it. How on earth will it do it? The figures seem to be that 1/3, depending on the GDP, comes from the city or from the finance capital, which is wholly international. And of course, as you know, you just go to the city, you hardly see a British company. So it's just out of the question. Britain just couldn't do it. And it's not that dissimilar in the United States, but it is different. The United States does have protection, has maintained protection, and is likely to increase protection, but it's limited for the reason Sandy's actually doing. It is the world finance capitalist power. It's constantly demanding that other countries remove the restrictions on finance capital, which for good reason they maintain. And it is trying to also even export its own goods. So there's just no way that it can go too far in protection. On the other hand, there's no question that protectionism is increasing. There's actually no question about it. I think the drive for globalization has gone into reverse. I don't think there's any doubt about that. You look at why the WTO negotiations, Doha, failed. That's why. The United States maintains its protection on agriculture. It can't change that, and it might increase it. It might even increase protection on certain individual industries, but it's limited. So basically, I agree with Sandy. In relation to what was said by Mike about integration existing during the Second World War, of course that's true. IBM, after all, was in Germany and is being sued for collaborating with the Nazis, isn't it? You can go through this. It's true, but you didn't have finance capital in this extraordinary form that you do have today at that time. You just didn't. It didn't exist. That integration didn't exist. And if you look at what globalization means, it's primarily finance capital. It's primarily finance capital. So what you would have to be talking about is that that's broken. Well, obviously the United States isn't going to try and do that. It won't do that. On the other hand, you are obviously getting increasing elements of protection, and you could expect the protection to increase in countries which can protect, like certain third world countries. Yes, of course. Of course it's going to increase. But as I say, it is a strategy, and it is limited over time. That is what's actually happening. It's unlikely, though, that you're going to get in the developed countries a rise of nationalism of the kind that you saw in Nazi Germany. The integration also, just say, of industrial production over the world is far greater. As we know, you're talking about China, well, that's precisely the case. The question of China is supposed to be discussed tomorrow, so there's no point in discussing it today, unfortunately, as you were. I take the point and actually agree with it, but I'll talk about it tomorrow. I just want you to talk about it today and not talk tomorrow, which is possible. I've forgotten your other point.
It's about environmental and how the ideology that's used.
Yes, well, actually, in the latest critique, I wrote the editorial, as I always do, and that's what it's about, exactly what you're saying. I think that in very large part, the environmental agenda has been taken over by state as a means of control. I think that's very, very clear. Talking of shortages which don't exist or needn't exist, reintroducing a Malthusian theme. It's quite obviously intended as a form of discipline, and it's completely ridiculous. I mean, you can imagine an idiot prime minister talking about plastic bags. And it's completely absurd, but that's the form it's taking. Obviously, there is a real problem with the climate, and this is a necessity to do it. But what they're doing is placing an onus on the individual, which is wrong, impossible, and will not solve anything. But if they're deliberately doing it as a means of control, I think that's true. And the Green Movement doesn't seem to have any idea what it's doing within that. They ought to be fighting that. And it's also true that the whole emphasis on shortages directly contrasts and opposes Marxism, as George Mondial made clear himself by was standing for shortages were as a slogan. And actually, they don't have to be shortages. The present apparent shortage is actually, that's food, is again largely speculation. It's not entirely speculation. I think the New Scientist had a long piece which pointed out one of the major reason for the relative shortage has got to do with what you were calling, somebody was calling neoliberalism, which I refuse to call it that because it's just simply a class of finance capital. And I don't agree with Nick that it was, they deliberately dreamed it up. It happened over time and they accepted it. Anyway, the whole point is that what they showed there was that the switch to private enterprise in the third world meant that private enterprise demanded a high rate of return from the investment. So, since they weren't going to get that, they didn't invest. And as a result, you didn't get the same growth in output that you had in the previous period. In other words, insofar as there's a shortage, it can easily be dealt with by correct investment. I mean, obviously there's certain caveats and all the rest, but that appears to be the case. You can read the New Scientist, and it goes into some detail, and it normally comes out in my view with idiotic green ideas, but it's quite clearly shown that there isn't a real shortage, in other words, or a long-term shortage. Of course, there will always be short-term shortages of everything whatsoever. Anyway, the basic point is that the state is using the environmental agenda as a means of control, and we have to be very careful of that.
Ask Hillel to make his concluding remarks now.
Thanks, the contributions have all been pertinent and interesting. I forgot to answer you on the question of the EU.
Oh, doesn't matter.
Well, yes, you're right. The downturn, of course, is affecting the EU. There's no question about it. It's obviously affecting Ireland, but it hadn't affected Germany for some time. It now is affecting Germany, and part of the reason for it, which we'll talk about tomorrow, has got to do with China. It's called China, China can't buy. And China can't export to Germany, so it's interconnecting with it. The rate of growth in Germany has gone right down. Germany, of course, is the core of the EU today, so we have to look at it and see what's happening there. And in that sense, it's very clear that there is a major problem in Germany, which is going to get worse. Quite obviously, if the world economy goes down, since it is the major exporter, it's going to be in very great trouble, which means the whole EU is going to be in trouble. That's true. Now, of course, the EU is basically divided between what amounts to the French-German axis, which has been there, which wants to integrate very tightly, as opposed to which you have Ireland, I think, would belong to that.
Oh, if it could.
Yeah. And on the other hand, you have Britain with its imperial past, doing its best to sabotage it. That's what it boils down to. But the rather curious policies of the Labour Party for the last 10 years have marginalised Britain. So in that sense, Britain isn't really part of what's happening in Europe as a whole. And you really have to look at what's happened in France, Germany, Spain, Italy. And it's clear that all of them are in considerable trouble. And they might well be in worse trouble than the United States, the way it's going. We've seen what's happened in Spain, which looks like, because of its housing prices, fairly dire. But Italy is much worse. The debt ratio in Italy, that's the debt to GDP ratio, is over 100%. The same is true of Belgium, which of course is in a political crisis. So yes, I mean, quite clearly there's going to be severe political changes, severe political economic problems, and considerable political changes. I think the outlook for Ireland isn't too good, to put it mildly.
No, I think I went back at a bad time.
Curiously, I gave a talk in Dublin in 2000, and I was saying, look, this downturn must come. And people thought I was nuts. That was sort of, had had degenerated to the level of the WRP kind of thing. But it's fairly obvious in the case of Ireland, because it's 5% of GDP came from the EU, and it isn't continuing it. Secondly, it very obviously depends on foreign investment coming into it, which it won't be able to. And as you're saying, you are going to get a shift of capital wherever it is. It's basically an assembly industry, isn't it? Unfortunately, it just doesn't look too good.
Are you saying that with a smile?
True. Well, where's Ben? Anyway, the question of the long wave. I'm amazed. I mean, I don't know who Richard Brenner is, but I'm amazed that he could say such nonsense. The question of the long wave in Trotsky, I discuss actually in the book that I edited, and I wrote 1/3 of it, and I discussed Trotsky's economics in sort of detail, including the long wave. And ever since I thought I didn't have to write very much more, since I'd rewritten it as well. Anyway, the point is that it's Mandel who brought it back, as it were, and you read in Mandel, you can reference it if you want, as well. The point is that Trotsky brought the idea to the fore, but he wasn't the first to bring the idea anyway, as Mandel makes very clear. But he brought it to the fore in his famous speech for the Comintern on the current economic situation in 1921. And in there, there's I think it's about 3 pages where he discusses the concept of the long wave. So why Richard Brennan doesn't know it, I don't know. Obviously, he never reads the Comintern documents. However, Trotsky also wrote a speech to the Communist Academy, which was run by Pierre Brzezinski. I think was it 23 or 24? I can't remember the date. Which is precisely on the long wave. And that was reproduced in a book produced by the American SWP in, I think it's something like, something on daily life. I don't know why it's in that collection, but I can't remember the exact title, but it's something to do with daily life. And that speech which he never delivered, he actually didn't turn up, so we simply produced the speech which he didn't give. You might have thought that was the end of it, but it wasn't. And in this book, which I edited and wrote for, there I think there are 2 pieces where Trotsky wrote further on the concept of the long wave after 1923-24. So there's absolutely no question that Trotsky wrote quite a lot on the concept of the long wave, and was very much part of his thinking. So obviously, Richard Brennan just doesn't read Trotsky. That's all I can say. The concept which Trotsky has is actually fairly straightforward. It is the view that you have these these very long ups and downs, roughly 50 years, and that it basically saying, simplifying it, oversimplifying it, all it's saying really is that you have a long period of an upturn when the bourgeoisie has cleared the conditions for investment. And that will occur, and it gives an example of wars or class struggle. In other words, when the bourgeoisie has defeated the working class, created the conditions for investment in other ways, it will invest on a fair scale, and then you'll get an upturn. During this long upturn, you will get upturns and you'll get a cycle, but the cycle will be down. And when it turns, you get the reverse, that's a much deeper down. Because it's an interrelationship between politics and the categories, one can use it even outside the concept of a long wave. It's quite a powerful conception. Mandel points out that Trotsky didn't invent it, it came from a guy called Van Gelder actually talked about it in 1912-13, and before then you get it as well. So it's part of the socialist movement. I'm simply amazed at this guy not actually knowing it. And anybody who knows any kind of history as well, political economy would actually know that. I personally think he's probably right, except you have to be very careful when actually using it and not just plonk it down. And just incidentally, Kondraty had got the idea from Trotsky. Trotsky says it in the speech. and tax idea. Conductive thing, I don't know why anybody ever talks about it. It's a technical crisis which is dubious, you know. Okay, I can invent a cycle, a construction cycle over 60 years. How many years do you have to apply it, and how can you prove it? There's so few possibilities in it, you really can't prove it. You know, in 200 years' time, you can say it was right or wrong. Nobody can say it's right or wrong at the present time. At most, we've got 200 years. It's pretty dubious if you want to begin in 1789 or 1800. Really. So, if you really want to look at things, presumably you'd want to look at 1850 or something. So, anyway, so the conductive cycle shouldn't really be, isn't a serious thing to be taken up by the left. It's a technical thing which is right or wrong, nobody's proven it, so goodbye. And I'm amazed anybody even talks about that.
You raised it.
What?
You raised it.
I mean, I raised it now. Yes, no, that's true, I did. And just to explain it, that's because the Will Jeffries actually raised, there was a reference to it, and at that meeting he'd actually raised it, but he opposed it too, but it was at that meeting. And it did look to me as if quite a few people had picked it up, but what's his name who's left? Yeah. Nick actually raised the issue, which I thought was important to kind of smash it. Smash the idea. I agree with Sandy in the question of nationalism. If you actually look at what the bourgeoisie is actually writing, it's quite clearly against nationalism today. Well, it couldn't be in favor of it. When you have so-called globalization, how can it be in favor of nationalism? So insofar as you've got the rise of nationalism, it would have to be in third world countries and in peripheral countries or parts of countries which are trying to break away. That's the only way it can actually manifest itself. The problem with it today is that it can't work. That's to say, Sandy's right. I mean, what are they actually going to give? And the obvious example being Scottish nationalism. There's no doubt there is Scottish nationalism. Nobody doubts that it's there. But let's assume the SNP comes in, which I think is quite probable actually, and let's say they win a referendum. So, what are they going to give to the working class? Are they going to be able to actually give anything to the working class? I think it's highly unlikely. It's quite possible that they'll give more money to teachers and doctors, try and buy up the middle class. That's perfectly possible if they've got the money. But it's much more likely that they won't have the money. The history of all nationalist movements, if you look at the present time, is they turn to the left as the SNP, come to power, and within a year, 2 years, or 3 years, turn to the right, quite far to the right. You look at that, that's what happened in Quebec, because they have to, we're within the world system. So there really isn't any future for it. And that doesn't alter the fact that there can be nationalist movements. The problem is that they can't solve the questions. Somebody raised the question of, I think he raised the question of how about Russia and Georgia? Yes. Well, actually, Boris can answer that better than I can. But when I look at Eastern Europe, I think the nature of the nationalism there is very, very different from what you would think. And it's really a particular response, it's a particular defense to what was going on. So a defense to a void which had actually opened up. Anyway, I can go into this for a long time. One has to be able to explain what actually happened in Southeast Europe, in Balkans, and you can't explain it in the usual Marxist ways of simply saying it's a growth of the middle class, which needs a market or needs a base or whatever. That clearly isn't the case. What then gripped the population of Serbia or Croatia? I think it's much more a case of people being wholly uncertain, facing a void, actually losing themselves in this process and just clinging on to their own elite at the particular time was devastating results. That's the way it looks to me. Now, okay, it's absolutely true, let's finish with this, the working class is not acting in this present time. I didn't raise the question because I think it's obvious. But it's also true that what is happening is changing, as we say, is changing the climate around us. The political climate around us is clearly changing. Michael over there brought up the question of what being said in Wall Street, kind of, are we going to Lenin? Is the left coming in? Well, it's real. I mean, bourgeoisie has been in advance of the working class for many years. Its consciousness has been developed precisely because they could be overthrown. At the same time, it's also true that in the last period they've been particularly stupid. But the central ruling class isn't stupid, and it does understand the process. However, the point I'm making is that I think the climate, the intellectual climate, is changing. And it's clear that the bourgeoisie is actually scared because they can see what the future would lead to. They do realize they have to do something. And it's clear, equally clear, that a section do want to find some form of compromise. That's actually there. At the same time, of course, I do agree with what John was saying. We really have authoritarian governments in a sense. It's clearly the various laws passed against civil liberties in practically all the developed world are authoritarian in nature and can be used. But the confidence which used to exist in the market, remember, people remember 20 years ago, Thatcher came in. She didn't just come in for bad reasons, as it were. She came in part because of the failure of social democracy.
Somebody turned that phone off. Sorry, Philip.
Can we get rid of that phone? Where it is?
In somebody's bag.
Can we find out? Switch it off.
It's Mike.
Sorry.
Well, anyway, the point is that the apparent intellectual dominance of the market is over. It just is over. It's clearly failed. It's not just that finance capital patently has failed. The whole concept of the market raising the standard of living, being good for everybody, competition, it just ended. It just, who is going to support it? It was supported to a degree, as we know, in the 80s by the working class. It wouldn't be today. The main problem we've got, or the main two problems we've got, is an adequate theory, and the other one, which we've been saying 100 times over, is the absence of a group which really is Marxist, which is able to act, which is honest, as opposed to dishonest, I'm sorry to say, of certain groups. That we don't have. And as long as we don't have a leadership, a party, or whatever, clearly the working class will not be able to act. I think the idea of spontaneous action is simply wrong. It simply won't happen, in spite of Mark might think. There has to be an alternative. I mean, it's one of the reasons, of course, why nothing happens in Russia. If people don't think an alternative is possible, or think the alternative is going to go the same way as what has existed, or even worse, turn into the Soviet Union, well, who on earth would want to join anything? You'd be mad to if you really think that is the case. So we have to demonstrate that there really is an alternative. And what is worse is we have an alternative in front of us of groups which are so awful, you can't believe it. I think that's the real obstacle. We can't rely simply on the climate changing in favor of it. That is what is happening. But I am hopeful that with the climate changing, we'll be able to get something off the ground. Thank you.